Samuel Carson had been living alone in the Arizona mountains for exactly 10 years, 2 months, and 16 days. He knew the exact count because he marked each day on a wooden post beside his cabin, a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. The mark served as both a calendar and a reminder of how long he had been running from the memories that haunted his sleep. His cabin sat in a hidden valley, surrounded by towering red rocks and accessible only by a narrow trail that most people would never find. Samuel had chosen this location carefully after the war ended, seeking a place where civilization couldn't reach him, where the screams of dying soldiers couldn't echo off the walls. The Apache Wars had taken everything from him: his family, his faith, and his ability to trust another human being. Samuel's days followed the same pattern they had for a decade. He rose with the sun, tended to his small garden, checked his traps, and maintained the cabin that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. His only companions were the desert animals that had learned to tolerate his presence, the occasional trading post visit when his supplies ran dangerously. The trading post trips were necessary, but painful experiences. Samuel would ride his horse, Thunder, down the mountain once every few months, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and his rifle always within reach. The townspeople had learned not to stare at the scars that covered the left side of his face, souvenirs from an Apache raid that had killed his wife and young son 10 years ago. Samuel Carson had once been a different man. Before the tragedy, he had been a respected rancher with a thriving cattle operation, a beautiful wife named Mary, and a 6-year-old son called Tommy. His ranch had been one of the largest in the territory, and his reputation for fairness in dealing with both settlers and Native Americans had made him a natural mediator in disputes. The attack had come without warning on a peaceful Tuesday morning in spring. Samuel had been out checking his cattle when Apache raiders struck his ranch. By the time he returned, his home was burning, his livestock scattered, and his family was gone. He had found their bodies in the ruins of what had once been their kitchen. Something inside him had died along with them. The territorial authorities had organized pursuit parties, and Samuel had joined them with a fury that frightened even experienced Indian fighters. For 3 years, he had tracked and fought Apache bands across Arizona and New Mexico, earning a reputation as one of the most relentless and effective scouts in the territory. But the violence had only deepened his wounds, and eventually he had simply walked away from it all. Now, at 42 years old, Samuel looked much older than his years. His brown hair had gone mostly gray, and his blue eyes held a coldness that came from seeing too much death. He moved through his daily routines like a ghost, speaking only to himself and finding comfort only in the absolute solitude of his mountain retreat. The garden behind his cabin provided most of his food, supplemented by game he hunted and fish from the clear mountain stream that ran past his door. He had learned to make his own tools, repair his own clothes, and treat his own injuries. Self-sufficiency had become not just a way of life, but a form of protection against ever needing another human being again. Samuel's cabin was Spartanly furnished, but well-maintained. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living area, with a stone fireplace providing heat during the cold mountain winters. His few possessions were practical items: clothing, tools, weapons, and a small collection of books that he read and reread by firelight. The only decoration was a small wooden cross that Mary had carved for him during their first year of marriage. The silence of his mountain valley was profound, broken only by the sounds of wind through the pines, the babbling of the stream, and the occasional call of an eagle circling overhead. Samuel had grown to love this silence, finding in it a peace that human company had never been able to provide. The quiet allowed him to think, to remember the good times with Mary and Tommy without the intrusion of other people's voices or concerns. But the silence also magnified every sound that didn't belong. Samuel's years as a scout had honed his hearing to an extraordinary degree, and he could identify the approach of any living creature long before it came within sight of his cabin. This skill had kept him alive during his fighting years, and now served as an early warning system against unwanted visitors. On this particular October morning, Samuel was splitting firewood beside his cabin when he heard something that made him freeze with his axe raised above his head. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, the soft footfalls of multiple people moving carefully through the forest below his valley. His military instincts immediately took control, and he set down his axe to reach for the rifle that was never more than arm's length away. Samuel had prepared for this possibility. Despite his isolation, he knew that his location might eventually be discovered by someone, perhaps territorial authorities looking for him, or outlaws seeking a hideout. Or worst of all, Apache warriors who might remember him from the war years. He had escape routes planned and supply caches hidden throughout the mountains. But as he listened more carefully to the approaching sounds, something puzzled him. The footsteps were too light and too numerous to be a military patrol or outlaw band. There seemed to be many people, but they were moving with a caution that suggested fear rather than aggression. Most strangely, he could occasionally hear what sounded like muffled crying or whispered conversations in a language he couldn't quite identify. Samuel positioned himself behind a large pine tree where he could see the main trail leading to his cabin while remaining hidden from view. His rifle was loaded and ready, but something about the approaching sounds made him hesitant to assume hostile intent. After 10 years of complete solitude, he had almost forgotten that not all unexpected visitors were necessarily enemies. The sun was reaching its zenith when the first figure emerged from the tree line below his cabin. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he saw not a warrior or lawman, but a young Apache girl, perhaps 16 years old, moving slowly up the trail toward his home. She was followed by another girl, then another, until 10 Native American girls of varying ages had gathered at the edge of his clearing. The girls appeared exhausted, frightened, and desperately in need of help. But Samuel Carson had spent 10 years learning to trust no one and need nothing from the outside world. Now, the very people whose kin had destroyed his family were standing at his front door, and he had no idea what they wanted or whether their presence meant. His carefully constructed isolation was about to end forever. Samuel remained hidden behind the pine tree for nearly an hour, watching the 10 Apache girls huddle together near his cabin's front porch. They ranged in age from what appeared to be 12 to perhaps 19 years old, all dressed in torn and dirty traditional clothing that spoke of hard travel and desperate circumstances. The oldest girl seemed to be their leader, constantly looking around with watchful eyes, while trying to comfort the younger ones who were clearly exhausted and scared. What struck Samuel most was their condition. These were not healthy, well-fed members of a raiding party or tribal group. The girls showed signs of starvation, their clothes were in tatters, and several appeared to be injured. The youngest girl, who couldn't have been more than 12, was limping badly, and 2 others showed signs of fever or illness. Whatever had brought them to his mountain refuge, it wasn't aggression or tribal business. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities as he observed them. During his years as a scout, he had learned enough Apache language and customs to understand that young unmarried girls rarely traveled alone, especially not in such a mixed-age group without adult supervision. Something catastrophic must have happened to their families or tribe to leave these girls wandering the mountains without protection. The longest girl, who appeared to be their spokesperson, finally approached his cabin door with careful steps. She knocked gently on the wooden door, then stepped back respectfully and waited. When no answer came, she knocked again, this time calling out in broken English that surprised Samuel with its clarity. "Please, we need help," the girl said, her voice carrying a mixture of desperation and dignity. "Now we are hungry and lost. We mean no harm to anyone here." Samuel could see tears streaming down the faces of several younger girls, and his heart began to soften despite his determination to remain uninvolved. The sight of children in distress awakened something in him that he had buried along with his own son 10 years ago. But his survival instincts and deep-seated distrust kept him from revealing himself immediately. The girl at the door continued speaking, sometimes in English and sometimes in Apache, explaining their situation to the empty air. From her words, Samuel began to piece together their story. They were survivors of an attack on their village, not by soldiers, but by Mexican slave traders who had crossed the border to capture Apache women and children for sale in Mexican markets. The slave traders had struck their village at dawn, killing the men and older women who resisted and capturing everyone else. These 10 girls had managed to escape during the chaos, but they had been wandering the mountains for weeks without adequate food or shelter. Several members of their original group had already died from exposure and hunger, and the survivors were barely clinging to life. Samuel's knowledge of the region told him that the girl's story was entirely believable. Mexican slave trading was a constant threat to Apache communities, and the isolated nature of many villages made them vulnerable to such attacks. The territorial authorities had little interest in protecting Apache settlements, viewing them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. As he listened to more of their story, Samuel realized that these girls had specifically sought out his cabin because they had heard stories about the white man who lived alone in the mountains. Their description of him was surprisingly accurate, suggesting that his reputation had spread even among Apache communities. They knew he was a former soldier, but believed he might be different from other white men because he lived apart from society. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows when the youngest girl collapsed from exhaustion and fever. The sound of her falling and the cries of alarm from the other girls finally broke through Samuel's defenses. His medical training from his army days told him that the child was in serious condition and needed immediate attention. Samuel emerged from his hiding place slowly, his rifle held in a non-threatening position, but still ready for use if necessary. The girls immediately clustered together in fear. But their leader stepped protectively in front of the group, clearly prepared to defend the others despite her own exhaustion. "I heard what you said," Samuel spoke in careful English, keeping his distance. "The sick one needs help." The leader studied Samuel's scarred face and weathered appearance, trying to determine whether he represented safety or additional danger. Her eyes took in his rifle, his defensive posture, and the obvious signs that he was accustomed to violence. But desperation overruled caution, and she nodded toward the collapsed girl. "She has fever for many days. We have no medicine, no food. Please, we ask only for help to save her life." Samuel approached the unconscious girl carefully, aware that his every movement was being watched by 10 pairs of frightened but alert eyes. His examination revealed symptoms of severe dehydration and what appeared to be an infected wound on her leg. Without treatment, she would likely die within hours. The practical side of Samuel's mind told him to give the girls some food and water, point them toward the nearest town, and send them away from his refuge. But the sight of the dying child awakened memories of his own son's illness years ago, and he found himself unable to turn away from their need. "Bring her inside," he said finally, holstering his rifle and opening his cabin door. "The rest of you can shelter on the porch tonight." The girls hesitated, unsure whether to trust this scarred white man who had emerged from the forest like a ghost. Their leader made the decision for them, carefully lifting the unconscious girl and following Samuel into his cabin. The others remained outside, ready to flee if necessary, but unwilling to abandon their sick companion. Samuel's cabin, which had felt spacious during his years of solitude, suddenly seemed cramped with 2 additional people inside. He cleared his sleeping area and helped the Apache girl lay her unconscious friend on his bed. The contrast between his sparse, orderly living space and the desperate human need now present in it struck him powerfully. As Samuel began treating the sick girl's wounds and fever, he was acutely aware of the leader watching his every move. Her eyes followed his hands as he cleaned the infected wound. Mixed herbs he had learned to use for medicine, and carefully administered water to the unconscious patient. There was intelligence in her gaze, and Samuel realized she was memorizing his techniques for future use. "What is your name?" Samuel asked as he worked. "I am called Ayana," she replied carefully. "It means eternal blossom in my language. The sick one is my sister Itzel." Samuel nodded, concentrating on his medical work, but aware that this simple exchange of names had created the first personal connection he had made with another human being in 10 years. The isolation that had protected him from further emotional pain was beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure whether to welcome or fear what might follow as night fell over the mountain valley. Samuel Carson found his carefully ordered solitary existence suddenly filled with the sounds and presence of 10 young Apache girls who desperately needed his help. The man who had spent a decade avoiding all human contact was now responsible for the lives of children whose people had once been his enemies. The transformation had begun, though neither he nor they yet understood how completely their lives were about to change. The first night with the Apache girls in his refuge tested every assumption Samuel had made about his capacity for human interaction. Itzel's fever broke near dawn after hours of careful nursing, but her recovery meant that Samuel could no longer pretend this was a temporary situation. 10 pairs of eyes looked to him for guidance, food, and protection, responsibilities he had spent a decade avoiding. Samuel discovered that feeding 10 hungry girls required resources he had never needed to consider. His carefully planned food stores, sufficient for one person through the winter, would last perhaps 2 weeks with his new guests. His small garden, his hunting and fishing, his entire system of self-sufficiency had been designed around solitude. Not community. More challenging than the practical concerns were the emotional demands. The girls had been traumatized by their experiences, and several of the younger ones suffered from nightmares that filled his quiet cabin with sounds he wasn't prepared to handle. Samuel, who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional numbness, found himself confronted with raw human pain that demanded response and comfort. Ayanna emerged as the natural leader among the girls, and Samuel found himself relying on her to translate not just language, but cultural expectations. She explained that the girls came from 3 different Apache bands that had been trading together when the Mexican slavers attacked. Their survival had depended on forming a temporary family unit, with Ayanna taking responsibility for the group. Despite being only 18 years old, the dynamics among the girls fascinated Samuel, despite his efforts to remain detached. They had created their own hierarchy, based not on age, but on skills and emotional strength. Chenoa, only 14, had become their scout and hunter because of her exceptional tracking abilities. Nayeli, 16, served as their healer and knew more about desert plants and medicines than Samuel had learned in his years alone. Samuel's daily routines had to be completely restructured to accommodate his unexpected household. Morning hunting trips now required planning to ensure the girls' safety while he was away. His evenings, once spent in silent contemplation, became filled with questions, conversations, and the simple logistics of housing 10 people in a space designed for one. The language barrier created both challenges and unexpected moments of connection. Samuel's Apache vocabulary, learned during his military years, was heavily weighted toward warfare and conflict. The girls' English varied widely, with some speaking quite well, while others knew only a few essential words. They communicated through a mixture of languages, gestures, and the universal expressions of basic human needs. As the days passed, Samuel noticed that his perspective on the girls was gradually shifting. Initially, he had seen them as Apache children, members of the group he blamed for his family's death. But daily interaction made it impossible to maintain that categorization. Ayanna's fierce protectiveness of the younger girls reminded him of Mary's devotion to their son. Little Ciala's laughter while playing with a carved wooden horse he had made years ago sounded exactly like Tommy's giggles. The practical arrangements for their stay became more complex as Samuel realized the girls couldn't simply leave when Itzel recovered. They had no adult relatives to return to, no village to shelter them, no resources to survive on their own in the harsh mountain environment. Mexican slave traders were still operating in the region, and sending the girls back into that danger would be tantamount to condemning them to capture or death. Samuel found himself making modifications to his cabin and surrounding area to accommodate his expanded household. He built sleeping areas on the covered porch, expanded his garden, and created storage spaces for additional supplies. Each modification represented a step further away from his solitary existence and deeper into a commitment he wasn't sure he was prepared to make. The girls contributed to their shared survival in ways that surprised Samuel. Chenoa's hunting skills supplemented his own efforts to feed the group. Nahel's knowledge of medicinal plants improved their healthcare capabilities. Others showed talents for cooking, sewing, and maintaining their improvised household. Samuel, discovered that community survival could be more effective than individual. Self-sufficiency. AIYANA, single quotes, relationship with Samuel, developed slowly. Built on mutual respect and shared responsibility for the other girl's welfare. She observed his routines carefully, learning his methods of hunting, gardening, and maintaining their mountain refuge. Her intelligence and natural leadership abilities impressed Samuel, reminding him that Apache culture produced capable and resourceful people despite the stereotypes promoted by territorial authorities. The emotional connections forming between Samuel and his unexpected family created internal conflicts he struggled to understand. His rational mind told him that temporary sanctuary was sufficient, that he could help the girls survive until alternative arrangements could be made. But his heart, dormant for 10 years, was beginning to respond to their presence with feelings he had thought permanently buried. It's all's complete. Recovery marked a turning point in their situation. The sick girl who had precipitated Samuel's involvement became a symbol of what their shared effort could accomplish. Her gratitude, expressed in careful English and traditional Apache phrases, moved Samuel in ways he wasn't prepared for. When she shyly presented him with a small beaded bracelet she had made during her recovery, he found himself accepting the gift with emotions he couldn't name. The approaching winter added urgency to their situation. Samuel's mountain refuge, adequate for one person, would be severely tested by the needs of 11 people during the harsh Arizona winter. Fuel, food, and basic warmth would require careful planning and probably some luck. But the alternative, sending the girls away to face winter, slavers, and starvation on their own, was unacceptable. Samuel began making supply runs to the trading post, purchasing items he had never needed during his years alone. Blankets, winter clothing, additional tools, and preserved foods strained his financial resources, but seemed essential for their survival. The trading post owner noticed the changes in Samuel's purchases, but asked no questions, respecting the unspoken code of the frontier, that a man's business was his own. The girls adapted to their mountain environment with impressive resilience. They learned Samuel's routines, contributed their own skills, and began to transform his stark refuge into something resembling a home. Their presence filled the cabin with sounds, smells, and energy that Samuel had forgotten existed. The silence he had cherished for 10 years gave way to conversations, laughter, and the comfortable noise of people living together. As October progressed toward November, Samuel Carson faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. The girls needed permanent protection and guidance that went beyond temporary shelter. They had begun to see him not just as a rescuer but as a father figure, a role he had never expected to fill again. His choice was between returning to the solitude that had defined his existence for a decade or accepting responsibility for 10 young lives that had somehow become intertwined with his own. The decision was complicated by his growing attachment to the girls, particularly Ayanna, whose strength and wisdom impressed him daily. She was no longer just an Apache girl seeking shelter, but a young woman whose courage and intelligence had earned his respect. Their relationship was developing in ways that challenged Samuel's assumptions about both Apache culture and his own capacity for human connection. Winter was coming to the Arizona mountains, and with it, the necessity for choices that could not be postponed or avoided. Samuel Carson, who had spent 10 years hiding from life, found himself at the center of 10 young lives that needed his protection, guidance, and care. The isolated hermit was becoming, despite his resistance, the patriarch of an unlikely family, forged by circumstance, need, and the gradual recognition that survival might depend not on solitude, but on connection. Winter arrived early in the Arizona mountains that year, bringing with it challenges that tested every aspect of Samuel's expanded household. The first heavy snow fell in mid-November, transforming his hidden valley into a pristine white landscape that was both beautiful and potentially deadly. The 10 Apache girls had never experienced mountain winters, and Samuel found himself not only providing shelter, but teaching essential survival skills. The cabin that had seemed adequate for one person became cramped and challenging with 11 residents. Samuel had spent weeks before the first snowfall expanding their living space. building additional sleeping areas and storage rooms attached to the original structure. The girls had helped with construction, learning carpentry skills while contributing their own knowledge of traditional building techniques. Ayanna proved invaluable during the winter preparations. Her natural intelligence and leadership abilities made her Samuel's unofficial partner in planning and organization. Methods of food preservation, weapon maintenance, and winter survival with remarkable speed. Their working relationship evolved into something deeper as they spent long hours together ensuring their household's survival. The other girls adapted to mountain winter life with varying degrees of success. Chenoa thrived in the snowy environment, using her tracking skills to hunt small game, even in harsh conditions. Nayeli expanded her medicinal knowledge by learning about mountain plants and herbs that could treat winter ailments. The younger girls struggled more with the cold, isolation, but gradually adjusted to their new circumstances. Samuel discovered that his 10 years of solitary winter survival had prepared him well for the logistical challenges of housing multiple people. His methods of heating, food storage, and resource management scaled up effectively. More difficult were the emotional and social aspects of communal winter living. The cabin filled with conversations, disagreements, laughter, and tears that contrasted sharply with his decade of silence. The language barrier gradually diminished as the girls' English improved and Samuel expanded his Apache vocabulary. Evening conversations around the fireplace became opportunities for cultural exchange, with the girls sharing stories of their traditional life and Samuel describing his experiences in the outside world. These exchanges helped bridge the gap between their different backgrounds and experiences. Samuel's relationship with Ayanna deepened significantly during the long winter months. Her intelligence, strength, and compassion impressed him daily, while his protection and guidance gave her security she hadn't known since her village was attacked. Their partnership in managing the household evolved into emotional intimacy that surprised both of them. The age difference and cultural barriers seemed less significant as they discovered their compatibility and mutual respect. The romantic development between Samuel and Ayanna created complex dynamics within their household. The other girls observed their growing closeness with interest and approval, seeing it as natural that their leaders would be drawn to each other. Apache culture included traditions of marriage between different tribes and even different peoples, making their relationship less unusual than Samuel had initially feared. Samuel struggled with his growing feelings for Ayanna, torn between genuine affection and concern about their different backgrounds and ages. At 42, he was nearly 24 years older than Ayanna, though her maturity and life experiences made the gap seem less significant. More troubling were his memories of Mary and Tommy, and his fear that opening his heart again would lead to more devastating loss. Ayanna approached their developing relationship with the directness and honesty that characterized Apache culture. She made it clear that she saw Samuel not as a temporary protector, but as a potential life partner, someone with whom she could build a future. Her openness about her feelings both thrilled and terrified Samuel, who had spent 10 years avoiding such emotional vulnerability. The winter months also brought practical challenges that required creative solutions. Food supplies ran lower than expected, forcing Samuel to make dangerous trips through heavy snow to reach his emergency caches and the distant trading post. The girls learned to make their clothing and food last longer while contributing their own skills to supplement their resources. Samuel's trips to the trading post revealed that their situation had attracted attention in the outside world. Territorial authorities had learned about the Apache girls living in the mountains and were divided about what action to take. Some viewed them as potential threats or problems to be relocated to reservations. Others saw them as victims deserving protection. Samuel realized that their peaceful winter retreat might not remain secret or safe indefinitely. The threat of outside interference added urgency to Samuel's decision-making about the future. He could no longer postpone choices about whether their arrangement was temporary or permanent. Girls had made it clear they considered his mountain refuge their home and him their guardian. Ayanna's feelings went deeper than guardianship, and Samuel found himself reciprocating emotions he had thought permanently buried. Spring's approach brought both relief and anxiety. The harsh winter had strengthened bonds within their unusual family, while demonstrating their ability to survive together under difficult conditions. But warmer weather would also bring increased contact with the outside world and decisions about their long-term future that could no longer be avoided. Samuel's internal struggle between solitude and community reached a crisis point as winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains. The man who had fled human contact for 10 years had spent months surrounded by people who depended on him completely. Rather than feeling trapped or overwhelmed, he discovered that responsibility for others gave his life meaning that solitary existence had never provided. Ayana's influence on Samuel's emotional healing became more apparent as spring approached. Her presence had gradually drawn him back from the emotional numbness that had protected him since his family's death. The laughter, conversation, and simple human warmth she brought to his life reminded him that joy was still possible despite past tragedies. The relationship between Samuel and Ayana also influenced the other girls positively. They saw in the growing love between their leaders a model for their own futures and hoped that they too might find happiness despite their traumatic experiences. The stability and security of the household gave them space to heal from their own losses while preparing for independent adult lives. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in Samuel's expanded garden, decisions could no longer be postponed. The outside world was taking increasing interest in their situation, and Samuel knew that authorities would eventually require formal resolution of their status. The girls needed legal protection, education opportunities, and preparation for their futures as adults in a complex and often hostile world. Samuel found himself contemplating marriage to Ayana not just as an expression of his love, but as a practical solution to many of their challenges. A formal marriage would give her legal status and protection, while establishing his permanent commitment to the entire group of girls. It would also formalize what had already become true in practice. They were a family bound not by blood, but by choice, circumstance, and mutual caring. The decision facing Samuel Carson as his second winter of community life ended was whether to embrace fully the role of husband and father that circumstances had thrust upon him. The isolated hermit had become the center of 10 young lives, and one of those lives had captured his heart in ways he had never expected. Spring would bring new challenges and opportunities, but also the chance to build something permanent from the temporary arrangement that had saved them all. Winter had transformed more than just the landscape of Samuel's mountain valley. It had melted the ice around his heart and shown him that love, family, and community were still possible, even after devastating loss. Ayana and the other girls had given him back his humanity, while he had given them safety, protection, and the chance to build new lives from the ruins of their old ones. Spring brought both renewed life to Samuel's mountain valley and unwelcome visitors from the outside world. The first sign of trouble came in early April when Noah, on one of her hunting expeditions, spotted a group of territorial soldiers making their way up the mountain trails toward their hidden refuge. Samuel's decade of peaceful isolation was about to end, and the future of his adopted family hung in the balance. Captain William Hayes led the military expedition, accompanied by a territorial administrator named Harrison Webb and an Apache interpreter called Joseph. Their mission was to investigate reports of white men living with Apache women in the mountains, a situation that violated several territorial regulations and social expectations. Samuel watched their approach through field glasses, recognizing the type of men who had once been his colleagues, but were now potential threats. Samuel called a family meeting to discuss their options. The 10 girls gathered around him in the main room of their expanded cabin, their faces showing worry but not panic. They had learned to trust Samuel's judgment during their months together, and they waited for his guidance about how to handle this new crisis. Ayana sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture of support and partnership. The choices facing them were limited and dangerous. They could try to hide in the deeper mountains, but winter had shown them that survival without adequate shelter and supplies would be nearly impossible. They could surrender to the authorities and hope for fair treatment. though the territorial government's record with Apache people was not encouraging. Or Samuel could try to negotiate from a position of strength, using his military background and knowledge of territorial law to protect his family. Captain Hayes reached their cabin just after noon, his small party heavily armed and obviously prepared for resistance. Samuel met them outside, alone and unarmed, presenting himself as a responsible citizen rather than a fugitive or renegade. His military bearing and calm demeanor immediately established him as someone to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Conversation that followed was tense but civilized. Captain Hayes explained that territorial authorities had received reports about Samuel's situation and were concerned about potential violations of federal Indian policy. The presence of Apache girls in an unregulated environment, particularly with a white man who had a history of conflict with Apache peoples, required official investigation. Samuel responded with careful honesty, explaining how the girls had come to his refuge as survivors of Mexican slave traders and how he had provided temporary shelter during a harsh winter. He emphasized his role as protector rather than captor and offered to provide any documentation or evidence needed to verify their story. His military record and known reputation in the territory gave weight to his explanations. Administrator Webb was more suspicious than the military captain, viewing the situation through the lens of territorial policy rather than humanitarian concern. He questioned Samuel's motives in sheltering Apache girls and suggested that permanent arrangements needed to be made for their relocation to appropriate reservations. His implication was clear: the current arrangement was temporary and would not be allowed to continue. The Apache interpreter, Joseph, played a crucial role in the investigation. He interviewed each of the girls separately, confirming their stories about the slave trader attack and their desperate flight to the mountains. His report supported Samuel's version of events and helped establish that the girls were genuine refugees rather than captives or willing participants in any illegal arrangement. Ayanna's interview with Joseph was particularly important. She spoke with dignity and intelligence about their situation, making it clear that she and the other girls had chosen to remain with Samuel rather than being forced to stay. Her obvious education and articulate explanations impressed even Administrator Webb, who had expected to find frightened or coerced captives. The investigation revealed the complex legal and social issues surrounding their situation. The territorial government had no clear precedent for dealing with Apache refugees who had chosen to live with a white family rather than moving to reservations. Samuel's military record and reputation as a former Indian fighter actually worked in his favor, as it established his credibility and patriotism. Samuel made a bold decision during the official interviews. He announced his intention to marry Ayanna and formally adopt the other 9 girls, creating a legal family structure that would give them all protection under territorial law. This proposal shocked the officials, but also provided a framework for resolving their situation within existing legal structures. The marriage proposal created immediate complications and opportunities. Marriage between whites and Native Americans was legally possible in the territory, but socially controversial. Samuel's proposal would make Ayanna a citizen by marriage, while establishing him as the legal guardian of her sister relatives. It was an elegant solution to a complex problem, but it required official approval and social acceptance. Ayanna's response to Samuel's public proposal was immediate and wholehearted acceptance. She had been hoping for such a commitment, but hadn't expected it to come as part of a legal strategy to protect their family. The other girls showed obvious joy at the prospect of permanent security and Samuel's formal commitment to their welfare. Captain Hayes found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to evaluate a situation that defied easy categorization. Samuel Carson was clearly not the renegade or Indian sympathizer they had expected to find, but rather a veteran struggling with personal loss who had found himself responsible for 10 refugee children. The captain's military background made him sympathetic to Samuel's position, while his duty required him to ensure compliance with territorial policy. The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes heated. Administrator Webb insisted on extensive documentation and official oversight of any permanent arrangements. He wanted regular reports on the girls' welfare education, and integration into territorial society. Samuel agreed to these conditions, while insisting on his right to raise his adopted family according to his own judgment and values. The breakthrough came when Joseph suggested involving the territorial government's Indian Affairs Office in creating a formal agreement. By treating the situation as an adoption and marriage case rather than an Indian policy issue, they could bypass many of the regulations that would have required the girls' removal to reservations. Samuel would become their legal guardian through marriage and adoption, with official oversight but practical autonomy. 5 years after the territorial officials had legitimized their unusual family, the Carson household had become a model of successful cross-cultural integration that drew visitors and admirers from across the American Southwest. Samuel and Ayanna's marriage had produced 2 additional children, young Samuel Jr. and baby Mary, named after Samuel's first wife, in a gesture that honored both past and present love, the mountain valley that had once sheltered one isolated hermit, now bustled with the activities of a large, productive family. Samuel had expanded their original cabin into a substantial ranch house with separate rooms for the older girls, nurseries for the babies, and common areas that could accommodate their extended family and frequent guests. The transformation of the physical space mirrored the emotional growth that had taken place in all their lives. The 9 adopted daughters had grown into accomplished young women who bridged Apache and American cultures with remarkable skill. Chenoa had become a renowned tracker and guide, leading hunting and exploration parties for territorial officials and wealthy visitors. Nayeli had developed her healing knowledge into a medical practice that served both Apache communities and frontier settlements, earning respect from trained doctors for her innovative treatments. Itzal, the girl whose near-death had first brought Samuel into contact with the group, had shown remarkable artistic talents, creating beadwork and pottery that was sought after by collectors throughout the region. Her recovery and subsequent success had become a symbol of the healing power of love and family support. Several of the other girls had married and started their own families, but they remained close to their adopted father in the mountain home. That had saved their lives. Samuel's relationship with Ayanna had deepened and matured over their 5 years of marriage. What had begun as a partnership born of necessity had evolved into a profound love that enriched both their lives. Ayanna's strength, wisdom, and cultural knowledge had made her an invaluable partner in Samuel's work as an unofficial mediator. Between Apache communities and territorial authorities, the territorial government had come to rely on Samuel's unique position and expertise in dealing with Apache-related issues. His household success had demonstrated that peaceful coexistence between cultures was possible, and officials frequently consulted him on matters of Indian policy. Samuel had found new purpose in this role, using his military background and family connections to prevent conflicts and promote understanding. Samuel's reputation had spread throughout the American West, attracting visitors who wanted to see the remarkable family he had created in the Arizona mountains. Writers, government officials, military officers, and even foreign travelers made the difficult journey to his mountain ranch to observe what many considered a unique social experiment. Samuel and Ayanna welcomed these visitors, using their interest to promote better understanding between different communities. The success of the Carson family had also attracted attention from Apache communities throughout the region. Many Apache families sought Samuel's help in dealing with territorial authorities or accessing services and resources. His home had become an unofficial embassy where Apache leaders could meet with government representatives in a neutral, safe environment. Samuel's role as a cultural bridge is particularly important during a period of increasing tension between Apache communities and the expanding territorial population. His reputation for fairness and his Apache family connections made him a trusted mediator who could understand both sides of disputes and conflicts. Several potential wars had been avoided through his intervention and negotiation. The education of Samuel's children had become a model for cross-cultural learning that influenced territorial policy. Girls were fluent in both English and Apache languages, skilled in both traditional and modern crafts, and knowledgeable about both cultures, histories, and values. Their success demonstrated that bicultural education could produce capable confident citizens who strengthened, rather than threatened, American society. Ayanna had become a leader in her own right, serving as an advocate for Apache women and children. Throughout the region, her intelligence, education, and legal status as Samuel's wife gave her access to decision-makers that most Apache people could never achieve. She used this influence to promote healthcare, education, and fair treatment for her people while maintaining her own cultural identity and traditions. Samuel's business enterprises had grown to support his expanded family and their various activities. His ranch now included cattle operations, mining interests, and trading relationships that generated substantial income. More importantly, these businesses employed both Apache and Anglo workers, creating economic opportunities that demonstrated the benefits of cooperation rather than conflict. The youngest Carson children, Samuel Jr. and Mary, were growing up in an environment that most children of their era never experienced. They played with Apache cousins, learned traditional stories alongside American history, and developed language skills and cultural knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. Their existence proved that mixed families could produce healthy, happy children who enriched both communities. Samuel's transformation from isolated hermit to family patriarch and community leader was complete, but he never forgot the journey that had brought him to this point. He still maintained the markers on the wooden post that had recorded his years of solitude, now adding marks for marriage, adoptions, births, and other family milestones. The contrast between his past and present served as a constant reminder of life's potential for unexpected change and growth. The 10th anniversary of the girls' arrival at his cabin was celebrated with a grand gathering that brought together Apache leaders, territorial officials, and friends from throughout the region. The celebration honored not just their family's success, but the possibility of cooperation and understanding between different peoples. Samuel's speech at the anniversary dinner reflected on the miraculous transformation that had begun with 10 desperate girls appearing at his door. Samuel spoke about the healing power of love, the importance of accepting help from unexpected sources, and the truth that families could be created through choice as well as birth. He credited Ayanna and the girls with saving his life as surely as he had saved theirs, acknowledged that their courage in trusting a scarred stranger had made possible all the joy and purpose that followed. Ayanna's response to Samuel's speech brought tears to many in the audience. She spoke about the man who had emerged from the forest like a guardian spirit, who had chosen to love and protect children whose people had once been his enemies. She described their marriage as a bridge between worlds, their children as living proof that love could transcend all boundaries of race, culture, and history. As the celebration continued into the night, with Apache drums mixing with frontier, fiddles and traditional foods sharing tables with territorial specialties, Samuel Carson reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him from the depths of isolation to the heights of family joy. The man who had once wanted only to be left alone had become the center of a community that spanned cultures and created new possibilities for understanding and cooperation. The story that had begun with 10 frightened Apache girls appearing at a hermit's door had become a legend that inspired people throughout the American West. Samuel and Ayanna Carson's family represented hope for a future where different peoples could live together in peace, prosperity, and mutual respect. Their love story had become larger than themselves, proving that even in the harsh realities of frontier life, love could indeed conquer fear, prejudice, and the seemingly impossible barriers that divided human beings from one another. The mountain valley that had once sheltered only Samuel's grief now echoed with the laughter of children, the voices of visitors from many cultures, and the sounds of a thriving community built on the foundation of one man's decision to choose love over isolation. The Apache girls who had come to his front porch seeking help had indeed transformed his life. But in saving them, Samuel Carson had discovered that he had saved himself as well.